So this video is going to be a bit of a behind the scenes look at how the videos I make are actually produced. And in particular, the focus this year for me has been on storytelling. And that is an element that I didn't quite realize how big that was. Cut to montage. When I started my channel, the goal was to make the experience of wildlife photography and all the adventures that go along with it accessible. With every new video, I wanted to top the last one. I quickly discovered that the key element to making these videos engaging is the story itself. And so I started to travel far and wide in search of the story, bringing industry professionals together to find compelling moments in nature. In this video, we take a look behind the scenes. Earlier in this year, I took a little bit of a story finding trip over to the island of Skomer. I've not been there before, but if you look at any British wildlife photographer's checklist, you will find Skomer somewhere near the top. It's an island that's famous for its puffins and other seabirds, and so I thought I'd take a trip and just see what it was all about. So every trip for me starts the same way, and that is taking my two lovely dogs over to my parents for a little bit of a dog holiday. So that's the dogs dropped off, and I've just put it into the sat nav for where we're going, and it's going to be 5 hours of drive time. So rather than have you look at me drive for 5 hours, I think I'm just going to let the video do its thing, and I'll add some stuff in here. So being located quite centrally in the UK, anytime I head to the coast it is quite a drive, so it was about 5.5 hours from where I live over to the west coast of Wales to Broadhaven. We stayed in Broadhaven because the accommodation we found was cheap and we weren't too far away from where we needed to be to get the boat in the morning. So knowing I was going to Skomer, it's one of these destinations where you see a lot of photos and a lot of video come out of, and one of the things I wanted to do was try and capture something that other people weren't necessarily looking at and try and get a different angle and different perspective on the Skomer visit. Now, with Skomer being such a destination for bird and nature lovers as well as photographers, it can get quite busy, and so you need to book well in advance. There are a couple of different types of trip you can do. The first option is to visit for the day, and the second option being to stay for multiple nights, but these are fixed stay periods, so it's worth bearing that in mind if you are planning to visit. Whenever I make one of my videos, I travel to the destination where we're going to be filming ahead of time, make sure there's a story there to be told. As much as nature is never a guarantee, I want to make sure I at least have something to offer in the video. So the first thing I did was head over to the Wick, which comes highly recommended by all the photographers that I met. They were saying that this is the best place in the island to be able to photograph and video puffins in flight. And that was my first angle that I wanted to explore, was a puffin's flight pattern and see if I could find a story there. So when we got to the Wick, there were plenty of burrows and also lots of activity, lots of birds in the air, but it had an onshore wind, which meant that the birds were coming in so fast that the cameras were just struggling to keep up with them. I was struggling to keep up with them, and we spent about an hour and a half to 2 hours in that particular area, which when you look at the timeline of where we were on the day, that was probably our biggest mistake, was staying in one point. So after 2 hours, we headed over to the other side of the island where there was an offshore wind and where the birds were coming in a lot slower and more predictably. And that enabled me to watch and observe the behaviors and try and find a story there. I was starting to lose hope in finding a story. I thought to myself, I could try and film a baby puffling being fed, and maybe I come back and document the raising of the pufflings next year. However, logistically that's a bit of a nightmare, and it's not something that happens in 3 days. So the angle there would be a bit too expensive for me to justify. So next approach was, let's look at the flight patterns again and see if there's anything there, a journey perhaps, maybe catch them on the water and hunting for the sand eels. And again, logistically, that's a bit of a nightmare. So I started to look a bit closer to where I was to see if there was a story there. And the one that I found me by accident. I was sitting watching the gulls that were right in front of me when one decided to launch itself at a puffin as it was coming in with sand eels. At the time when this happened, I'd just switched over to my photography setup and I was taking pictures rather than filming. The whole situation was over in a matter of seconds. In those few seconds though, there's a compelling story to be told. From both sides, of course. I think when you visit a place like Skomer, it can be very easy to overlook the details and stories that aren't associated with the target species you set out for. In my case, I was looking at puffins. However, I think there is a story to be told about the gulls on the island. They also are raising their young. Looking back at the photos, I could see that the puffin was there fighting for its life, and that's the story I wanted to tell. But not from the perspective of the puffin. I think the angle here is on the gull, because immediately you villainize the gull. However, looking a bit further out, that gull was feeding babies too. The longer I observed my new little friend, the quicker I realised that this wasn't just a smash and grab food theft. It wasn't sporadic. This was calculated and well thought out. The problem with being such a large bird is that the puffins could see you a mile off. And so the gull was moving along looking for vacant burrows, trying to find out which birds were out hunting, and then setting up camp right next door. So having watched this, I'm pretty sure that this is the actual story that I want to tell. There's a couple of filmmaking technical challenges here. The first being that my reaction speeds are going to need to be quick in order to make sure that I get the actual action. But the second and more challenging part of this is going to be to build a story compelling enough that the audience want to emotionally invest and root for the underdog. One thing is certain though, after the first hour on this island I decided I wanted to come back and stay. I have to say I do finally understand the magic of Skomer. There's something incredibly surreal about being surrounded by puffins who just don't seem to notice you're there. That being said, I do have some tips for you if you're heading over to Skomer or thinking about heading over to Skomer anytime soon. The first would be to make sure you book your tickets early. On this trip I did travel with a couple of friends, however we did have a friend who left it too late to book a ticket. So tip number 1, book early. The second thing I didn't really account for was the level of fitness that you need in order to go to the island. There is a lot of walking on the island and it's all up and down hills. Usually this wouldn't be a problem, but put 30 kilos of camera gear on and all of a sudden this becomes a real challenge. So tip number 2 would be to pack light and definitely pick appropriate footwear. I wore a lightweight pair of hiking boots on this trip and they came in more than useful on a number of occasions. And my third and final tip is to be considerate and leave space for others. Because of the nature of Skomer's landscape being covered in burrows, everyone is confined to the footpaths, and this does mean that you're limited for space. But there is more than enough space for everybody on the island. Even at the busiest part of the day, we really didn't feel like we had no space to work. And to be honest, everybody's in such high spirits there that it was a great community space to be in. So tip number 3 is just to be aware of others and be considerate. For me, the list could go on and on. It's such an incredible place that is definitely well worth a visit. Although this video is a little bit different to what I'd normally put out, I do hope that it's been useful. For me, this exercise of finding the story first has definitely helped me build out a plan for my next videos. I've done these story finding trips at a number of locations this year, including Bempton, which is another one that's up there on the top of people's lists. And it's put me in a really good position to be prepared for next year. If you've enjoyed taking this little trip behind the scenes with me, let me know in the comments, and then I can make a few more videos with educational content. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching.